It wasn't the thunder that woke her, but the silence that followed. In the Arizona Territory, a storm that loud never just passes. It breaks something. Out on Blackwood Ridge, miles from the nearest soul in Redemption Creek, Amelia Hayes knew that whatever had broken was now her problem. She lit a lantern, the flickering light casting long shadows in her small homestead, and pulled on her late husband's oilskin coat. The wind howled a warning, but a sound carried beneath it a low guttural moan that wasn't animal. It was the sound of a man drowning in his own blood. The night was a maelstrom of liquid fury, a sky torn open and bleeding onto the parched Arizona earth. Rain hammered the sod roof of Amelia Hayes's small cabin with the relentless rhythm of a war drum. For 3 years since her husband Thomas had succumbed to fever, she had grown accustomed to the profound loneliness of this land. She knew its every mood, from the sun-baked languor of midday to the predatory chill of a desert night. But this storm was different. It felt personal, an assault meant to tear her little world from its foundations. She had been mending a harness by the weak light of a tallow candle when she heard it. A splintering crash followed by the terrified whinny of her horse, Balthazar, from the lean-to. Grabbing the heavy Winchester rifle that was her constant companion, she moved to the door, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She peered through a crack in the timber. The rain was a solid silver sheet, distorting the world into a churning nightmare. She saw nothing but the deluge. Then came the moan. It was low, dragged from a chest filled with pain, and it was undeniably human. It sliced through the storm's roar and found her ear with terrifying clarity. Every instinct honed by years of solitary survival, and the cautionary tales of travelers screamed at her to bar the door and douse the light. The Apache were restless, they said in town. Sterling Thorne's ranch hands spoke of skirmishes and missing livestock, their words always laced with a venomous hatred. A lone woman was a beacon for trouble. But another voice, one that sounded much like her father, the old country doctor who had taught her how to set a bone and stitch a wound, whispered of duty. You don't let a soul bleed out in the mud, no matter the color of their skin. With a curse that was half prayer, Amelia unlatched the door and stepped into the gale. The wind stole her breath and plastered her calico dress to her skin. The lantern's flame sputtered wildly, threatening to abandon her to the suffocating darkness. Shielding it with her hand, she followed the sound, her boots sinking into the grasping mud. She found him near the broken section of her fence line. He was Apache. That much was clear from the stark planes of his face, the long, unbound black hair plastered to his skull, and the buckskin leggings he wore. He was sprawled on his side, one arm flung out, as if reaching for something the other pressed tightly to his torso. A dark, viscous pool was spreading from beneath him, thinning as it met the rainwater. Amelia raised the Winchester, her knuckles white. He was a warrior, built of lean, hard muscle that was now shuddering with the onset of shock. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of agony. Her gaze fell to the wound, a bullet hole ugly and torn high on his right side. It was bad. The angle suggested it might have pierced a lung. He couldn't be one of Thorne's men. They wouldn't leave one of their own to die. This was a raider, a renegade, the very specter of fear that haunted the settlers of Redemption Creek. Leaving him was the sensible choice. Dragging him inside was madness. It was an invitation for his kin to follow, or for a posse to accuse her of being a sympathizer. Either path led to ruin. His eyes flickered open. They were the color of dark, wet stone, and for a fleeting moment they held a lucid fire. He saw her the rifle, the lantern light glinting off the wet steel. He made no move, no play. There was only a quiet, defiant acceptance of his fate. He had lived a warrior's life, and this was a warrior's death. And in that moment he ceased to be a symbol of fear. He was just a man, no older than she, was dying in the dirt at her feet. Amelia's resolve shattered. The doctor's daughter won out over the terrified widow. "Damn it all to hell," she muttered, lowering the rifle. Getting him back to the cabin was a trial of strength she barely possessed. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her arms under his, her boots, finding no purchase in the slick mud. She strained, grunted, and slipped every inch of victory. He was semi-conscious, his breathing a ragged, wet-sounding hitch. Rain and sweat mingled on her brow, blinding her. By the time she hauled him over the threshold and kicked the door shut against the storm, she was trembling with exhaustion, her body screaming in protest. She dragged him to the hearth, the rough floorboards smearing with a trail of mud and blood. The fire had burned down to embers, but she stirred them to life, adding precious kindling until a warm golden light pushed back the gloom. In the steady glow she saw him clearly for the first time. His face, though contorted in pain, was strong with a high brow and a jaw that could have been carved from granite. A fresh laceration ran across one cheekbone. His body was a roadmap of old scars telling stories of battles she could scarcely imagine. She felt a pang of intimidation, a fresh wave of doubt. What manner of man had she brought into her home? Pushing the fear aside, she went to work. She fetched the medical bag her father had left her, its worn leather a comforting presence. With a sharp knife, she carefully cut away the blood-soaked buckskin from around the wound. The bullet had gone clean through a small mercy. The entry wound was small, but the exit wound on his back was a ragged, brutal mess. She boiled water, cleansing the wounds with carbolic soap that stung her own raw hands. The warrior remained stoic, his jaw clenched, but he did not cry out as she probed the torn flesh for debris. She worked with a focused intensity, her movements sure and practiced. She packed the wounds with clean gauze and bound his chest tightly with strips of linen torn from her own bedsheets, her finest ones. She forced a bitter willow bark tea between his lips to fight the fever she knew was coming. For 2 days and 2 nights the storm raged outside, and a different kind of storm raged within the cabin. The warrior, whose name she did not know, drifted in and out of a fevered delirium. He spoke in a language that was all harsh consonants and soft vowels, his words painting visions of galloping horses and sharp, sudden violence. Amelia stayed by his side, bathing his face with cool water, changing his dressings, and holding his hand when the tremors became too violent. In those long, isolated hours, the world shrank to the space of the small cabin, to the rise and fall of a stranger's chest, to the desperate, unspoken prayer for a single life to hold on until dawn. She was no longer a settler, and he was no longer an Apache. They were 2 souls adrift in a sea of pain, clinging to the fragile raft of a shared humanity. When the fever finally broke on the 3rd morning, it was as if the sun had broken through the clouds for the first time. The warrior's eyes opened, and this time the lucid fire remained. He lay still, watching her as she moved about the cabin, his gaze intense and unnervingly perceptive. The silence that fell between them was thick with questions neither knew how to ask. Amelia set a bowl of thin broth on the small crate beside his cot. "You need to eat," she said softly, knowing the words were meaningless to him. She made a gesture of lifting a spoon to her lips. He pushed himself up slowly, a grunt of pain escaping his clenched teeth. He took the bowl his hands, surprisingly steady, and drank. He did not thank her, not with words, but his eyes held hers for a long moment over the rim of the bowl, and in their depths she saw an acknowledgement. It was enough. The days that followed settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Their communication was a pantomime of gestures and sounds. He learned that the clatter of the pot meant food. She learned that a particular tilt of his head meant he needed fresh water for his dressings. He was a model patient, never complaining, his body healing with a speed that astonished her. The hard life of a warrior had forged him from iron. She would work her small homestead during the day, always conscious of the man inside her cabin. She milked her goat, tended her meager vegetable patch, and repaired the fence he had broken in his fall, all while casting nervous glances towards the horizon. The fear of discovery was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. What if Thorne's riders came by? What if a patrol from Fort Grant passed through? Her act of mercy would be seen as treason. In the evenings, he would watch her. While she stitched a tear in her dress or oiled the action on the Winchester, she could feel his eyes on her, not with menace, but with an unnerving, analytical curiosity. He watched the way her fingers moved, the way she tucked a stray strand of auburn hair behind her ear, the way her shoulders sagged with weariness when she thought he wasn't looking. It was as if he were memorizing her. One afternoon, he was strong enough to stand. He walked stiffly at first to the cabin door and looked out across her land. He saw the vast, empty expanse, the small, lonely cabin, the single horse and goat. He looked at her, and then back at the unforgiving landscape, and a new expression crossed his face. Not pity, but a kind of respectful understanding. He knew what it took to survive out here alone. He began to repay his debt in small ways. One morning she awoke to find he had taken her dullest knife and was sharpening it on a smooth river stone he must have found on one of his short walks. He honed it to a razor's edge, testing it on a sliver of his own thumbnail. He noticed the wobble in the leg of her table, and using that same knife, carved a perfectly fitted wedge to steady it. The repairs were small, silent gifts of service. The most profound moment came a week into his recovery. A rattlesnake, seeking warmth, had coiled itself near her woodpile. Amelia, lost in thought, reached for a log, her hand inches from the venomous reptile. Before she even registered the dry, menacing rattle, he moved. He was a blur of motion, covering the 10 feet between them in 2 silent strides. He snatched her arm, pulling her back with a force that spun her around, and with his other hand he flung a rock with breathtaking speed and accuracy. It struck the snake's head with a sickening thud, killing it instantly. Amelia stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, the ghost of a fatal sting on her skin. He still held her arm, his grip firm, his nearness overwhelming. The scent of him, wood smoke leather, and something uniquely masculine filled her senses. He released her slowly, his dark eyes searching her face, checking for fear. She saw none of the savagery the townsfolk spoke of. She saw only a fierce, primal protectiveness. "Thank you." She breathed the words, feeling utterly inadequate. He merely nodded his gaze, dropping to the dead snake before returning to her. In that shared brush with death, a new layer of understanding was forged between them. He was not just a patient, he was a guardian. The next evening he sat by the fire, working on a piece of cottonwood with his newly sharpened knife. For hours his hands were in constant fluid motion. Amelia watched, fascinated, as a shape began to emerge from the pale wood. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a small, exquisitely carved bird, a hawk in mid-flight, its wings spread wide. The detail was astonishing, from the individual feathers to the sharp, determined eyes. It was a thing of simple, profound beauty. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines. It was his story, his thanks, his farewell, all carved into a piece of wood. She knew then that he would be leaving soon. The knowledge left a surprising ache in her chest. She had grown accustomed to his silent presence, to the quiet security it brought. The cabin would feel empty again, the loneliness more acute than before. 3 nights later she awoke with a start. The cabin was still and silent, but she knew immediately that she was alone. The cot by the hearth was empty, the blanket folded neatly. The carved hawk sat on the table, its wooden eyes seeming to watch her. He was gone, vanished back into the wilderness as silently as he had appeared. He had left no tracks in the dust, no sign of his passage, save for the mended table, the sharp knife, and the hollow space his presence had left behind. Amelia picked up the hawk, its wooden form cool against her palm. She had saved a man's life, and in return he had given her a small piece of his spirit, a silent promise whispered on the wind. With the warrior gone, the oppressive silence of the high desert rushed back in to fill the void. Amelia found herself listening for the soft footfall that was no longer there, her eyes glancing towards the empty cot by the hearth. The loneliness was a physical weight, heavier now, that she had known, however briefly, a shared existence. The carved hawk became her totem, a smooth, constant presence in her apron pocket, a reminder that she had not dreamed the entire episode. Life, however, did not allow for quiet reflection. The shadow that had been gathering at the edges of her world began to creep closer. That shadow had a name, Sterling Thorn. Thorn owned the vast Cimarron Cross Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and grass that bordered Amelia's small homestead on 3 sides. He was a man carved from the same hard rock as the landscape, with pale, predatory eyes, and a belief that the world was his for the taking. He considered Amelia's quarter section, with its year-round spring, an intolerable intrusion on his domain. The spring was the heart of her land, the reason her husband Thomas had chosen this spot, and it was the very thing Thorn coveted with a corrosive greed. His first attempts to buy her out had been cloaked in a thin veneer of civility. He'd ridden up to her cabin himself, a massive man on a magnificent black stallion, his silver-inlaid saddle worth more than her entire homestead. "Mrs. Hayes," he had said, his voice a low rumble that did not match the smile on his lips. "A woman alone has no business in a place like this. It's dangerous country. I'll give you a fair price, enough to get you set up proper in Prescott, maybe open a little dress shop." "This is my home, Mr. Thorn." Amelia had replied, the Winchester held loosely but purposefully in her hands. "It's not for sale." Thorn's smile had tightened. "Everything is for sale, madam. It's just a matter of finding the right price." Now, with the turning of the seasons, his methods grew coarser. One morning she found 2 of her precious milk goats, with their throats cut, their bodies left to bloat in the sun. A week later, a section of her fence was torn down, and a dozen of Thorn's longhorns were allowed to trample her vegetable garden into ruin. She rode into Redemption Creek, a dusty, sun-bleached collection of false-fronted buildings, and went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a man whose ambition had long ago been baked out of him by the Arizona sun, leaving behind a husk of weary indifference. He sat with his boots on his desk, listlessly polishing his badge. "Sheriff," Amelia began, her voice tight with anger, "Thorn's men are destroying my property." Brody sighed, not bothering to look at her. "You got proof of that, Amelia? Did you see him do it?" "Who else would it be?" "He wants my spring." "Sterling Thorn is an important man in this territory," Brody said, finally lowering his feet to the floor. "He pays a good portion of the taxes that pay my salary. He says some of his cattle strayed. Says he's sorry for the damage. He's even offered to compensate you. I don't want his blood money. I want him to leave me alone." "Now, Amelia," the sheriff said, his tone condescending, You're getting hysterical. Thorn's a reasonable man. Maybe you ought to reconsider his offer. It's a lonely life for a woman out there." She left his office, her insides churning with a cold, helpless rage. The law in Redemption Creek was a tool for the powerful, a cudgel to be used against the weak. She saw Thorn's foreman, a brutish man named Bartholomew Bart Grissom, standing outside the saloon with a few other Cimarron cross hands. Grissom's face was a mess of broken veins and sun damage, and his eyes held a constant simmering malice. He watched her pass, a cruel smirk on his face, and deliberately spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her feet. In that single contemptuous act, she saw Thorn's hand as clearly as if he'd signed a confession. The final escalation came a few weeks later. She awoke to a foul taste in her water bucket. Rushing to the spring, her heart pounding with dread, she found the source of the corruption. A bloated, decomposing coyote carcass had been thrown into the clear pool, its fur rank and swarming with flies. The water, her lifeblood, was poisoned. It was a declaration of war. Cleaning the spring was a sickening, back-breaking task. She had to haul the rotting animal out, then spend 2 days bucketing out the contaminated water until it ran clear again. All the while she felt watched. She would see a flicker of movement on a distant ridge, a glint of sunlight off a spyglass. Thorn was no longer hiding his intentions. He was laying siege to her home, starving her out, poisoning her, well confident that the law would look the other way. That night, huddled by her hearth, the full weight of her isolation crashed down on her. The town was against her. The law was against her. The most powerful man in the county was actively trying to destroy her. She clutched the carved hawk in her hand, its sharp edges digging into her palm. She thought of the silent warrior with the watchful eyes. She remembered the feeling of his hand grabbing her arm, pulling her back from the snake. For those few weeks, she hadn't been alone. She had been protected. Now that protection was gone, a fleeting memory. As the coyotes howled their mournful chorus from the surrounding hills, Amelia Hayes felt a fear colder and more profound than any she had ever known. Sterling Thorn's shadow was covering everything, and she was beginning to doubt she would ever see the sun again. The seasons bled into one another, turning the green of a wet spring into the bleached bone colors of a brutal summer. Amelia survived, driven by a stubborn resilience that infuriated Sterling Thorn. She dug a new, shallower well, higher up the hill from the spring, a back-breaking task that yielded less water, but water that was hers alone. She spent her nights sleeping fitfully, the Winchester laid by her side, her ears tuned to every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind. In Redemption Creek, the talk was no longer of missing cattle, but of a new, unsettling power rising in the territories. Travelers and frightened prospectors brought stories of a new Apache war chief, a man who was uniting the scattered and feuding bands under a single, formidable banner. They said he was not an old, established leader, but a young, ferocious warrior who had appeared as if from nowhere. He led his people with a tactical brilliance that baffled the cavalry patrols and a ruthlessness that struck fear into the hearts of encroaching settlers. Amelia heard the name for the first time in Gable's Mercantile. She was trading a few precious jars of preserved peaches for flour and salt when 2 prospectors, their faces etched with fear and dust, stumbled in. "He's cleared the entire Dragoon Range," one of them said, his voice trembling. "Wiped out the survey team from the rail company. Just vanished 'em." "They call him Ronan," the other whispered, as if the name itself were dangerous. "They say he moves like a ghost and fights like a demon. He's taken back land the army swore was secure." Amelia froze her hand, hovering over a sack of beans. Ronan. The name was unfamiliar, but the description stirred a strange disquiet within her. They spoke of a leader with eyes like chips of obsidian, who carried the scars of many battles, but moved with the grace of a panther. A man who appeared where he was least expected. As the months wore on, the legend of Ronan grew. He became the boogeyman of the territory. Sterling Thorn in particular grew obsessed. Ronan's newly claimed territory bordered the northern edge of the Cimarron Cross Ranch, effectively halting Thorn's relentless expansion. Thorn saw the chief not as a distant threat, but as a personal enemy. "This savage is an affront to progress," Thorn declared loudly in the saloon one evening, ensuring Sheriff Brody could hear. "He's choking the life out of this territory. Something must be done." Thorn began funding his own private militia, offering handsome bounties for Apache scalps. His foreman Bart Grissom led brutal, indiscriminate raids into the foothills, inflaming the already volatile situation. The violence escalated, creating a bloody feedback loop of raid and reprisal. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Amelia felt trapped in the middle. The animosity towards all natives had reached a fever pitch. Her one-time act of compassion now felt like a secret that could get her hanged. She avoided town whenever possible, but on one necessary trip for supplies, she was confronted by Grissom and two of his men. "Heard you keep to yourself, Widow Hayes." Grissom sneered, blocking her path. His breath was sour with cheap whiskey. "Don't get many visitors way out there, do you? That's the way I like it. Mr. Grissom," Amelia said, keeping her voice level. "Funny thing," he continued, stepping closer. "Some of the boys who got chased by that devil Ronan's war party a while back, they were tracking a wounded buck. Said the trail led right up towards your land before the storm washed it out. You wouldn't know nothing about harboring vermin, would you?" Amelia's blood ran cold. It had been them, Thorn's men. They were the ones who had shot the warrior she had saved. The connection, sudden and sickening, clicked into place. The attack on him hadn't been random. It was part of Thorn's bloody campaign to clear the land. Her land. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her hand instinctively moving to the apron pocket where she kept the wooden hawk. Grissom's eyes narrowed. "You best be careful, Mrs. Hayes. In times like these, people who ain't with us are against us. And Mr. Thorn don't take kindly to people who are against him." He let her pass, but his threat lingered in the air long after he was gone. She hurried home, her mind racing. The man she had saved, the silent warrior who had sharpened her knife and protected her from the snake, was not just any Apache. The descriptions, the timing, the fierce intelligence, it all pointed to an impossible, terrifying conclusion. The nameless man she had pulled from the mud and the phantom chief named Ronan were one and the same. The knowledge was a dangerous fire in her heart. She was connected by a thread of secrecy and a shared enemy to the most feared man in the territory. Her small, isolated homestead, once a sanctuary, now felt like the center of a gathering storm. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the storm was about to break. The attack came on a moonless night. The air was still and heavy, the kind of oppressive quiet that precedes violence. Amelia had been on edge for days, a primal instinct screaming that Thorn's patience had finally run out. She had barred her door and sat in the dark, the Winchester across her lap, listening. The first sign was the smell of smoke. Not the familiar scent of her own hearth, but the acrid, greasy smell of burning hay and old timber. Her blood turned to ice. The barn. She burst out the door and saw it. Flames, angry and orange, were devouring the small barn that housed Balthazar and her milk goats. The terrified screams of the animals were a physical blow. Bart Grissom and 4 other Cimarron Cross riders were silhouetted against the blaze, their faces demonic in the flickering light. They were laughing, "Time to go, widow," Grissom bellowed, his voice thick with malicious glee. "Mr. Thorne's made you a final offer. Rage pure and undiluted supplanted her fear." She raised the Winchester and fired the report cracking through the night. The shot was hurried, meant to warn, and it kicked up dirt near one of the rider's horses, making it rear. The men, startled by her defiance, answered with a volley of their own. Bullets chewed at the log walls of her cabin, splintering the wood near her head. She ducked back inside her heart, hammering. This was it. They weren't here to scare her anymore. They were here to burn her out or bury her. The animals' frantic cries from the barn were cut short by the sickening finality of gunshots. Tears of fury and grief stung Amelia's eyes. "Come on out, little lady," Grissom taunted from the darkness. "We just want to talk." Amelia reloaded the Winchester, her hands shaking but her purpose firm. If she was going to die tonight, she would not die cowering. She would die on her feet, defending her home. She took a deep breath, ready to charge back out the door. And then a new sound entered the night. It started as a low, chilling cry from the ridges, a sound that was half wolf howl and half human cry of vengeance. It was answered from another direction, and then another, until the night was filled with the terrifying, ululating war cries of the Apache. Grissom and his men froze, their jeering laughter dying in their throats. They spun around, peering into the impenetrable darkness beyond the firelight. The air, which moments before had been empty, suddenly felt alive, teeming with unseen menace. An arrow fletched in black hissed out of the night and embedded itself in the throat of one of the riders. He fell from his saddle with a choked gurgle, his hands clawing at the shaft. Panic erupted. The riders spurred their horses, firing blindly into the darkness. From that darkness, shadows detached themselves. Warriors on foot, moving with a supernatural speed and silence, swarmed from the rocks. They were specters of death, their faces painted for war. They pulled riders from their saddles, their knives flashing in the firelight. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. Swift, brutal, and terrifyingly efficient. Grissom, his face pale with terror, managed to wheel his horse around, intending to flee. But a figure on a powerful pinto warhorse materialized from the smoke, blocking his path. The rider was taller than the others, his presence radiating an aura of absolute command. He wore no paint, but the firelight glinted off a map of old scars on his chest and arms. Amelia, watching from her doorway, felt her breath catch in her throat. Even from a distance, she knew him. It was the set of his shoulders, the way he sat the horse, the sheer coiled power in his stillness. It was the man she had saved. It was Ronan. He dispatched Grissom with a contemptuous, almost lazy grace, his war lance striking the foreman from his saddle. Grissom hit the ground with a heavy thud, his reign of terror ending in the dust of the home he had tried to destroy. The fight was over in less than a minute. The night fell silent again, save for the crackle of the burning barn. Ronan dismounted his warriors, melting back into the shadows, their grim work done. He walked towards the cabin, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He stopped a few feet from her, his face unreadable in the shifting light of the fire. He was no longer the broken, feverish man she had nursed. This was the chief of the legends, a man who held the power of life and death in his hands. He was intimidating, magnificent, and terrifying. One of his warriors, an older man with a heavily lined face, stepped forward beside him. He looked at Amelia, then at Ronan, and then spoke in clipped, heavily accented English. "He says the debt is not forgotten." Amelia stared, unable to speak, the Winchester still clutched in her hands. The warrior continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, translating Ronan's unspoken words. "You saved his life. A life for a life. That is our way. Your life here is over. The man Thorn will send an army for this. You will not survive." Ronan took a step closer, his dark eyes finally meeting hers. They were just as she remembered them, intense, perceptive, ancient. The translator spoke the final devastating words. "He is Ronan, chief of the people. He has not come only to save you. He has come to claim you. You will be his wife. This is the payment for the debt." The statement hung in the smoky air, more shocking than the raid itself. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of fact, delivered with the absolute authority of a king. The silent warrior she had saved from death had returned as a chief to demand her life in exchange. The first light of dawn was beginning to bleed over the eastern mountains, painting the smoke-filled sky in hues of grey and rose. The smouldering ruins of her barn were a black scar on the land, a funeral pyre for the life Amelia had known. The bodies of Grissom and his men had been removed, vanished, as if they had never been, leaving only dark stains in the dirt to prove the night's carnage had been real. Amelia stood before Ronan, the space between them charged with an impossible tension. His warriors remained in the shadows, a silent, menacing jury. The translator stood impassively by his chief's side. "Wife," Amelia finally managed to say, her voice a hoarse whisper. The word felt foreign, absurd. "That's not... You can't just..." The translator listened to her stammer, then conferred with Ronan in a series of low, guttural sounds. Ronan's expression didn't change, but his eyes never left her face. "He doesn't take what is not his." The translator clarified his English, slow and deliberate. "He was shot by the White Rancher's men because they want this land, this spring. The same men who would have killed you tonight. His fight and your fight are the same. He owes you his life. In his world, a debt of life is paid with life. By making you his wife, he places you under his protection. It is the only way he can guarantee it. It is an honor. An honor." To her, it sounded like a cage. She looked around at the ashes of her home, at the vast, lonely landscape. What was she protecting? A piece of dirt that everyone was trying to kill her for, a life of solitude and fear. "I can't," she said, shaking her head, the denial a reflex. "My world is here. I am not one of your people." Ronan spoke, then his own voice, low and resonant, a sound that bypassed the translator and seemed to speak directly to a place deep inside her. The translator's words followed. "Your world wants you dead. This sterling Thorn killed your animals and poisoned your water. He sent these men to burn you out and put you in the ground. The man with the star in the town will not help you. He is owned by Thorn. If you stay here, you will be dead by sunset. They will say you were killed by an Apache raid, and Thorn will finally have your spring." Every word was the cold, hard truth. She was trapped. Her own civilized world offered her only a shallow grave. This savage chief was offering her life, but at a price that stripped her of her identity, her past, everything she had ever been. What kind of life would that be? She asked, her voice trembling with the enormity of the choice before her. "A prisoner in your camp." Again, Ronan spoke, his gaze softening for just a fraction of a second. "He says you were not his prisoner when he lay helpless in your house. You will not be his prisoner when you are helpless in his." The translator added, "You will be the wife of the chief. You will be respected. You will be safe." Safe. The word mocked her. Would she ever feel safe again? She thought of the long months of terror, of sleeping with the Winchester, of the hatred in Grissom's eyes. Then she thought of the quiet days of Ronan's recovery, the feeling of his hand pulling her back from the snake, the silent understanding that had passed between them. He was a killer, a warrior, a man of profound violence. But he had shown her a gentleness and a protective instinct that no one else in this harsh land ever had. He was offering her a choice between two fires, the consuming fire of Thorn's greed and hatred, or the unknown fire of a new life among a strange people at the side of a man she barely knew but was irrevocably bound to. "He does not force you," the translator said, his tone suggesting the finality of the offer. "The sun is rising. Thorn will have heard the guns. He will gather his men. They will come. You can stay and meet them, or you can ride with us now. The choice is yours. But you must choose." Ronan held out his hand. It was not a plea, but a simple, open invitation. A bridge between her world and his. To take it meant leaving behind Amelia Hayes, the widow of Blackwood Ridge. To refuse it meant her death. She looked at his hand, strong, and calloused the hand that had carved the hawk she still carried in her pocket. She looked up at his face, at the unyielding certainty in his dark eyes. He was not a savior in the way she might have read about in books. He was a force of nature, as wild and unforgiving as the land itself. But he was also her only hope. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The ghosts of her past, of her husband, Thomas of her father, the doctor, all seemed to whisper warnings in her ear. But the raw, undeniable instinct for survival screamed louder. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of smoke and morning dew filling her lungs. The sun crested the mountains, and its first golden ray fell across Ronan's face. It was the dawn of a new day, and the dawn of a new life, or the end of one. The choice was hers to make, and the time for choosing was over. The decision, when it finally coalesced in the ruin of her world, was not a surrender, but a quiet, profound acceptance. Amelia looked from Ronan's outstretched hand to the smouldering funeral pyre of her barn, a structure she and Thomas had raised with their own blistered hands. She looked towards the distant dusty trail that led back to Redemption Creek, a town that had judged, dismissed, and ultimately abandoned her to the wolves. There was nothing left for her in that direction but the cold comfort of a grave marker, assuming Thorn even bothered to give her one. Her own hands, calloused and stained with the dirt of her land, trembled slightly. They were the hands of a survivor, a woman who had fought for every scrap of her existence. But survival was no longer about holding on to a piece of land. It was about letting go. She looked back at Ronan. His face was a mask of stoicism, yet his eyes held the vast, patient stillness of the mountains behind him. He was not offering her a world of comfort or ease. He was offering her a chance to draw her next breath. In a land that had become a crucible, his brutal honesty was the only currency that held any value. Slowly, deliberately, as if moving through deep water, she raised her hand and placed it in his. His skin was warm and rough, his grip firm and instantly reassuring. It was not the possessive grip of a captor, but the steadying hold of an anchor in a raging storm. A silent contract was sealed in the first golden rays of a new day, a pact witnessed only by the smoking ruins and the silent painted warriors who materialized from the shadows. Ronan gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of an unreadable emotion crossing his features before the mask of command settled once more. He released her hand and turned to his warriors, issuing a series of short, sharp commands in their harsh, musical tongue. The words were alien, but their effect was immediate and precise. Two warriors broke from the group, moving with a fluid, ground-eating stride towards the lean-to, which had miraculously survived the fire. They began to saddle her horse, Balthazar, with an efficiency that suggested they had handled countless horses in their time. "You may take what you can carry," the translator's voice cut through her thoughts. "We ride in minutes." Amelia walked back into her cabin, the threshold a border between the life that was over and the one that was yet to begin. The small single room seemed alien to her now, a museum of a forgotten existence. Her gaze swept over the familiar objects. What do you take when you are leaving a life behind? Not the practical things, the iron pots or the sturdy wool blankets. They had no place where she was going. These were relics of a civilization she was leaving forever. She ran a hand over the table he had fixed, a silent acknowledgement of their first connection. She moved to the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. From it she retrieved a worn, leather-bound book of poetry. Her mother had loved its pages, filled with gentle words of gardens and distant seas, a world away from this hard, violent land. It was a talisman of a softer past. Beside it she found the small, silver-backed daguerreotype of her parents taken on their wedding day. She stared at their hopeful, unlined faces, whispering a silent apology, a plea for understanding for the path she was about to take. Finally, she went to the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the cold hearth. The exquisitely carved hawk sat there, a silent sentinel. For a moment she considered taking it, this tangible piece of him. But she knew it belonged here. He had left it as a marker, a symbol of a debt fulfilled. It was part of their story, and this cabin was the first chapter. Leaving it felt right, a closing of a circle. In its place, she took her husband Thomas's simple gold wedding band from the small dish where she kept it. It no longer fit on her work-roughened fingers, but she closed her fist around it, the metal cool and solid against her skin. It was not a rejection of this new life, but a promise to herself that she would not completely erase the woman she had been. When she stepped back outside into the rapidly brightening morning, Balthazar was ready, his reins held by one of the warriors. He stood beside Ronan's fierce-looking pinto warhorse, which was adorned with a single feather in its mane and bore faded paint markings on its flanks. The Apache warriors were already mounted, a silent, formidable company of ghosts, given flesh by the dawn. They sat their horses with an easy grace, their dark eyes watching everything, missing nothing. Amelia suddenly felt clumsy, alien, a pale-skinned intrusion in their stark, elemental world. Ronan swung himself onto his pinto with a single fluid motion. He looked down at her, a silent question in his eyes. There was no mockery, no impatience, only a quiet assessment. Taking a deep breath, Amelia placed her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself into the saddle. She settled onto Balthazar's familiar back, the worn leather a small comfort in a world turned upside down. Just as she gathered her reins, a new sound intruded, the low, growing rumble of many hooves on the hard-packed earth. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, resolving itself into a posse of at least 15 riders. At its head, she could clearly make out the bulky form of Sterling Thorne, a rifle held across his saddle, and beside him, the slighter figure of Sheriff Brody. They were riding hard, confident in their numbers and their purpose. They were coming to find her body to enact their grim pantomime of justice and for Thorne to finally plant his flag on her spring. A bitter, triumphant smile touched Amelia's lips. They were too late. Ronan saw them too. He showed no surprise, no alarm. He simply raised his hand, palm out. It was not a dramatic gesture, but his warriors responded instantly. They fanned out, forming a loose crescent-shaped line between their chief and the approaching riders. Bows were nocked, with arrows, lances were shifted to a ready position. The movements were economical, silent, and perfectly coordinated, a display of lethal discipline that made Thorne's hastily assembled posse look like a rabble of drunken farmhands. The posse reined in their horses raggedly 100 yards away, their confident charge dissolving into confused uncertainty. Amelia watched the expressions on their faces shift from aggression to disbelief, and then to a dawning primal fear. They had come expecting to deal with a lone, dead woman. Instead, they were faced with a line of impassive warriors led by the man who had become the territory's blood-soaked legend. Thorn shouted something, his voice a faint, angry tear in the morning air. "Hayes, what is the meaning of this? Are you a traitor?" Ronan and his warriors did not deign to respond. They simply sat their horses, a wall of silent, deadly intent. Their contempt was a more powerful answer than any threat. Ronan held Thorn's gaze for a long, charged moment, his eyes seeming to strip the rancher of all his power and arrogance. In that silent standoff, a new boundary was drawn, not on a map with ink and paper, but on the earth itself, with the undeniable promise of violence. This land and the woman who had bled for it were now under his protection. Satisfied, Ronan turned his horse. The gesture was dismissive final. He nudged his pinto into a steady trot, not looking back, confident his point had been made. With a quiet command, he led his party away from the posse, away from Redemption Creek, and towards the high, rugged mountains to the north that shimmered in the morning haze. Amelia fell into line beside him. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her but smoke, sorrow, and the impotent rage of lesser men. Ahead lay an unknown world. As they rode, the sun climbed higher, warming her face. The land began to change the sparse desert scrub, giving way to the scent of pinon pines and the cooler air of the highlands. She rode beside the silent chief, their horses, moving in an easy rhythm. He had not spoken a word to her yet. She did not feel like a captive. In the face of the posse, he had stood before her, not behind her. It was a subtle distinction, but it meant everything. The trail ahead was uncertain, a path into a life she could not possibly imagine. She thought of the simple, terrifying questions. What would she eat? Where would she sleep? How would the women of his tribe receive her? The white-faced prize, claimed by their chief fear, was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. She had survived alone on Blackwood Ridge. She would learn to survive this. Glancing at the proud, unyielding profile of the warrior beside her, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over the turmoil in her heart. He was a paradox of violence and protection, a savage with his own stringent code of honor. She had stepped out of her world and into his legend. This was not a fairy tale ending, written in a book of poetry. It was the beginning of the hardest chapter of her life. But for the first time in 3 long years, she was not riding alone. And for better or for worse, she would follow this new trail all the way to its end, under the vast, open and unforgiving sky of the West. The story of Amelia Hayes and the Apache chief Ronan doesn't end here. It's where their true journey begins. Thrust into a new world, a new culture, and a marriage born from debt and desperation, their path is one of uncertainty and discovery. Did she make the right choice? Can a bond forged in violence and necessity ever blossom into something more? The Untamed West holds the answers. If this story of courage, survival, and the clash of two worlds captured your imagination, please let us know by hitting that like button. Share this tale with others who love the raw drama of the American frontier. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. We have so many more stories from the Wild West to share with you, filled with unforgettable characters, heart-pounding action, and the enduring spirit of those who dared to carve a life from the wilderness. What future do you think awaits Amelia and Ronan? Let us know in the comments below.